We are in the next to the last week of a series from which I've been learning so much. Brand new research for me. It's called Lessons of the Wilderness. And it's predicated on the sense that many of us have that as members of so-called mainline churches with declining memberships, and as citizens of a country that often seems to have forgotten its values, we are where? In the wilderness, yes. But what we have discovered, of course, Gary, as you know, as a student of the New Testament, in the biblical tradition, the wilderness has lessons to teach. And so we started with 1 Corinthians 10 with Paul's account of the wilderness generation. And the lesson that text taught us is that the wilderness could be a place where we disenthrall ourselves, where we remove Pharaoh from the heart, where we are cured of our Egyptomania, as the philosopher Eric Santner says. And then we looked at the stories of Jesus, tempted, tested by the devil in the wilderness. We focused especially on Luke's gospel, Luke's account. And we drew from that the lesson that it was Jesus's relationship with God, his constant dependence upon God, that brought him through that test. And then last week, we looked at the Gospel of Mark, who surprisingly places Jesus repeatedly in the wilderness. This was a discovery for me. I'd never noticed it before. And of course, as I did my research, I found out that an old Princeton New Testament scholar, Ulrich Mauser, already published a book back in the 1960s called Christ in the Wilderness, in the Gospel of Mark. Too bad I didn't find that book before I had already done my work. And now today we come to the Epistle to the Hebrews. And the people of God wandering through the wilderness is an explicit motif at a couple of points in this early Christian writing. In Hebrews chapter 3, verses 7 to 19, the wilderness is a place of testing, of trial, where most went astray in their hearts, where they lost their faith, where they rebelled. They became embittered. We'll talk more about the language later. They became embittered, and they turned against God, and they perished. That's the first text we're going to dig into later. And then, of course, we will turn to Hebrews chapter 11, that extraordinary chapter where the wilderness is a place of sojourn, a place of seeking, a place of yearning for a homeland. Now, so those are the two explicit mentions of the wilderness in the Epistle to the Hebrews, but as the great German scholar Gary Ernst Käsemann recognized, the journey through the wilderness actually supplies the framework, the architecture for the entire Epistle to the Hebrews, even when the wilderness is not explicitly mentioned. In this early Christian writing, the experience of Israel in the wilderness is recapitulated. The Exodus from Egypt, the construction of the tabernacle, which provides ongoing access to God's presence, the appointment of the high priest, and then the journey toward the promised land. All of that is recapitulated in Hebrews, even when the wilderness is not explicitly mentioned. And in the hands of the author of Hebrews, the wilderness wandering is repeatedly given meaning for today, for this day. He does that through a kind of interpretation that could be called typological. And we'll talk more about that later. The point is that by means of a typological hermeneutic, the author intensifies the wilderness experience for his own readers and for us. And for all of those reasons, Ernst Käsemann gave his stimulating monograph the title, published in 1957, the title, Das Wandelnde Gottesvolk, which means what? The wandering people of God. That's exactly right. By the way, when Diane and I were students in Tübingen a long time ago, one night we joined a Fackelzug. Does anyone know what that is? A torchlight parade, holding torches from the center of the university to the home of Ernst Käsemann. It was his 80th birthday. And he came to the door and greeted us, and we sang happy birthday to the great Ernst Käsemann. He was so old by that time that he very seldom came to the university. He only came one time while I was a student, and that was to hear Jacob Neusner. Well, first, it's important, actually necessary, for me to say a few words about the so-called epistle to the Hebrews, a writing that may not be very familiar to us, certainly not as familiar as the Gospel of Mark or the letters of Paul. In the first place, Hebrews is not really an epistle. The writing is completely lacking in the features and the formulas of a letter. In other words, there is no prescript. What's the prescript? From somebody to somebody. And it's almost entirely lacking in a postscript. All you get are you get one greeting at the end. The author describes his own work in chapter 13, verse 22, as a logos parakleseos, which means what? Yes, a word of exhortation. And the word logos there is important. This very designation, logos parakleseos, word of exhortation, is used to describe the synagogue address that Paul is invited to deliver in Acts chapter 13. So that's what Hebrews actually is. Properly speaking, it is what? A speech. It's a discourse. It's a sermon. And it exhibits all of the rhetorical features of an oration in great abundance, in greater abundance than any other New Testament writing. Gary, one of my PhD exams at Vanderbilt was on the prologue to the epistle to the Hebrews, right? And the first sentence of that prologue, as it turns out, is a classic example of a Greek period, a form of thought and expression that was taught by teachers of rhetoric. Listen, you can hear it even in Greek, what's going on. Palumeros kai palutropos palai hotheos. You hear those P sounds, right? The alliteration. The pleonasm in many parts and in many ways. Of old, God spoke hotheos lalesas tois patrasin to the fathers in tois prophetais. And now comes the turn and the race for the finish line. Episcopal. But at the end, ton hemeron tuton of these days, elalesin hemin in huio. He spoke to us in a son. That's a perfect Greek period. Do you know what the word period means? Racetrack. And Greek speakers crafted their sentences like a racetrack, with a slow start, a turn, and then what? A kick, right? A race to the finish. This man, whoever wrote Hebrews, is the only person who knows how to do that in the New Testament. It's a rhetorical form. And so Hebrews is properly described as a sermon or a speech. Second thing you need to know, this writing is anonymous. The author is not named anywhere. Now, the earliest surviving manuscript of Hebrews, which is the Chester Beatty Papyrus, P46, dated by some scholars to the 3rd century, so it's old. In this papyrus, Hebrews is included just after Romans. Now, what does that tell you? Someone thought it was what? A letter of Paul. Someone thought that. It was included in the Pauline letter corpus. But the educated leaders of the early church in the East, like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, these people were the teachers in the catechetical school of Alexandria in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, and they already recognized that this was not a letter of Paul, that the language, the substance of the thought and the style was not Paul's own. Now, Clement of Alexandria tries to explain the connection with Paul and the discrepancy of language and thought by the theory. This is what Clement says. He says, Paul must have dictated one of his sermons in Hebrew, and Luke must have what? Translated it into Greek and improved the style quite a bit. But Origen, who was even more highly educated than Clement of Alexandria, my old patristics teacher at the University of Chicago, a mean old man, was this being taped? Named Robert Grant, once said in one of his seminars that Origen was the only intelligent early Christian. Well, that's not true. But he was certainly the most highly educated. And Origen refused to speculate on the identity of the author, concluding his remarks on Hebrews with the famous statement, "Who wrote this letter? God knows." God knows who wrote it. But that didn't stop other church fathers from speculating. You know, nature abhors what? A vacuum, right? And so Tertullian, 2nd century, early 3rd century, church father in North Africa, Tertullian suggested Barnabas as the author. Barnabas was called in the book of Acts a son of consolation. And so Tertullian said maybe he is the author of this word of exhortation. Luther, does anyone know? Who did Luther think wrote it?
Apollos.
Apollos, exactly. Luther proposed the eloquent, educated, probably tall and handsome, Alexandrian sophist, a Christian sophist. Bruce Winter has called him Apollos. Well, that's an interesting idea. Why? Because that typological hermeneutic that we talked about is something that the author of Hebrews shares with the Alexandrian Jew Philo. And so, Apollos would seem to be a likely candidate. The problem is, we know almost nothing about Apollos. We don't know much about his thought, his theology. And most recently, some scholars have actually proposed that Hebrews was written by Priscilla. Right? The wife of Aquila, the colleague of Paul. Can you figure out why they would suggest that? Actually, Gary, that suggestion I found goes back to Adolf von Harnack. He's the first one. But it's gained in popularity recently, not only because of feminist hermeneutics, but mainly because the archaeologist discovered the Priscilla catacomb in Rome. Have you heard about this? You can go, if I could get the church to travel with me, if I could get this class to go with me to Italy and Greece, I would take you to the Priscilla catacomb. And what you would see there, painted on the wall, is a fresco of Priscilla. And guess what she is holding in her outstretched hand? A book. Right.
Must be the letter P.
Must be, John. Right. Yes, Michael.
It might also be just the whole fact that it's anonymous. So
Yes.
many other letters are either known to come from
Right.
Paul, or else they're attributed to a male leader.
Exactly.
So now you've got this totally anonymous letter, and let's face it, I've heard the saying sometimes anonymous was a woman.
That's interesting. The fact that the letter appears very early in New Testament manuscripts, despite the fact that it was and that it is anonymous, and despite the fact that no one could plausibly connect the letter with an apostle, a male apostle, that is the surest indication of the quality, the power, the beauty of the writing. Right? Here was a letter that found its way into the New Testament without what? An apostolic sponsor, right? Without the stamp of apostolicity. The earliest quotation of Hebrews, it turns out, is in 1 Clement. A writing that didn't quite make it into the New Testament, a long letter, 65 chapters, from the church at Rome to the church at Corinth. I'm supposed to be writing a commentary on 1 Clement, and I'm trying. The due date is 2020. No, 2022. I have two more years. Anyway, 1 Clement quotes Hebrews in chapter 32, verses 2 to 6. To be sure, the quotation is not exact, and it is not explicit. But it is clear that it is Hebrews that he is quoting. Now, that helps us establish a kind of framework for the date of this writing. 1 Clement could be plausibly dated sometime between 80 and 120 AD. So Hebrews must have been written before what?
80.
Yeah, at least before 120. This is what scholars call a terminus ad quem. The only other hint that we get of the date is that at the very end of the letter, chapter 13, verse 23, the author mentions a certain Timothy. Here's the quotation. Be informed, our brothers and sisters, that Timothy has been released. If he comes soon, I shall see you with him. Now, what do you think? Should we assume that this Timothy is whom? Paul's companion and co-worker. If we assume that, then it is difficult to imagine that Timothy would still be alive and traveling after about 100 AD. So I think that it is safe probably to date the epistle to the Hebrews sometime between 80 and 100. Now, why is that important? It's important because of the passage of time. And that turns out to be crucial to the situation of the readers. The author reminds the readers more than once of what they heard at the beginning, in the early days, which they ought not now to neglect. In chapter 5, verse 12, the author says, by this time, you should have become teachers. You should be teaching others. But you still need yourselves. You still need elementary instruction. And the passage of time, the author says, has brought about sluggishness. The Greek word for sluggishness, this is important, we'll talk about it later, is nothros. Can you say that with me?
No.
Nothros. And it means laziness, carelessness, right? So the early commitment and fervor, the intensity of belief has begun to wane. They have become sluggish. And a little bit later, chapter 12, the author tells them to lift up their drooping hands and to strengthen their weak knees. Now, as somebody who has not long ago passed the age 60 boundary, I know something now about drooping hands, right? And weak knees. My old lawnmower broke last summer. It now has only 3 wheels. Guess what the 4th wheel is? My right arm. So, whenever I use that lawnmower, I know for a 60-plus old man, that's where you get drooping hands, right? This is important for understanding what this letter is all about. Time has passed. Probably a whole generation. Maybe 2 generations. And people's faith has grown cold. They are sluggish. Now, the third thing that we don't know is we don't know to whom this letter was written. We don't know the identity of the addressees. It appears that the letter is addressed to an actual community or communities. In chapter 10, verses 32 to 34, the author asks his readers to recall their earlier days as followers of Christ. And then he goes on to mention some of their experiences back then. And this suggests that the author has a specific community or communities in mind. But who were these Christians? And where were they? Well, the title of the work, which is what? To the Hebrews, Pros Hebraeus, has suggested to a lot of readers that the recipients of the writing are what? Jewish Christians, exactly. And that's what commentators have concluded, both ancient and modern. Some commentators locate these Jewish Christians, you can probably guess where, in Palestine, perhaps even in Jerusalem. But others suggest that there were Jewish Christians living all around the Mediterranean. We know that there were Jewish Christian house churches in Rome. And in the last chapter, chapter 13, verse 24, the author sends greetings from, quote, those of Italy, the Italians. And so, to some scholars, that has indicated that maybe this letter was written and addressed to Jewish Christian house churches in Rome. Now, that's everything we don't know about this letter. But what we do have an opportunity to reconstruct, and it's very important for us in trying to learn the lesson of the wilderness. Whoever the addressees may be and wherever they are, the situation of the readers is clear. The danger confronting these Christians is losing their first confidence. That's the way the author puts it. Wavering, that's his language, wavering in hope. And even, listen to this, forsaking the Christian assembly. That's all found in chapter 10. And then the author goes on to recall the early days. After you had been enlightened, so after the awakening, after the enthusiasm, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to abuse and persecution, and sometimes being partners with those who were so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you cheerfully accepted the plundering of your possessions, knowing that you yourselves possessed something better and more lasting. That's chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. But now, after some time has passed, there is the danger that they will, quote, abandon their first confidence. Chapter 10, verse 35. And that they will shrink back. Chapter 10, verse 39. Well, by now you've figured out that maybe the situation of these readers is close to our own. All right, now, I think we are ready, finally, to turn to the two passages in which the wilderness experience is explicitly discussed. The first of the two passages is in chapter 3, verses 7 to 19. Now, it's important for you to know that this passage provides a commentary, an exposition on Psalm 95. And Psalm 95 is a recollection, listen to this, of the infidelity, the faithlessness of the Israelites in the wilderness. And that infidelity, that loss of trust, led to rebellion. Rebellion against Moses and ultimately rebellion against God. Okay, let's work our way through the text, and I want to point out some things that are going on in the Greek that you can't see in English and that really change our way of understanding this. Therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says, today. Now, this word is important for the author. He repeats it over and over again. It's the Greek word semeron. Can you say that with me? Semeron. Today, this present day. So everything the author is about to say about Israel in the wilderness is actually meant for whom? For his readers at the end of the first century, and for us, for those of us who are living today. Today, if you hear his voice, God's voice. Now, this is a phrase that the author uses several times, and it's important. The author believes that remaining faithful is a matter of listening. Listening for the voice of God. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. Now, the English translation of this Greek word, the Greek word is parapikrasmos. Parapikrasmos. That's a long word. Can you say that with me? Parapikrasmos. Do you see right there at the center of it that root peak? That root means bitter. And the meaning, Chuck, of this word is not captured by the English translation rebellion. Rebellion makes you think that what happened to Israel in the wilderness was a revolt against God. It was a failure of obedience. But a literal translation goes like this: do not harden your hearts as you did when you became embittered. Now that's a message for us. Where do I find myself becoming embittered? That's where my faith, where my trust and fidelity is endangered. It begins with embitterment. And that happened, the author continues, on the day of testing or trial. In the wilderness, there's our word, in te eremo, where your fathers tested with scrutiny. And they saw my works, the works of God, for 40 years. The Greek expression that is used there to describe what they were doing wrong, and that's translated to test with scrutiny, is the Greek word dokimatsein. And dokimatsein is a testing of qualifications, and in most cases, it implies a skeptical attitude. It's the development of a critical distance from God, skepticism about what God is up to, putting God under scrutiny, the works of God. The works of God that are being referred to here, of course, are what? All of the ways in which God provided for Israel in the wilderness. He gave them what? Manna to eat, ancient cream of wheat, of course. And when that didn't please them, He sent what? Flocks of quail, yes, which I so dearly love. And water from a rock. But rather than being grateful and trusting, the Israelites skeptically criticized, they scrutinized God's works.
Larry,
Yes,
is the writer quoting the Septuagint, or is it kind of a free-flowing
he is. He begins with a paraphrase of the Septuagint of Psalm 95. But in just a minute, halfway through his exposition, he begins quoting explicitly. And that's what we ought to look out for here. So he says, therefore, and this is God speaking, I was angered at this generation, and I said, they are always going astray. The Greek word is planontai. Can you figure out what that word means and what word we get from it? You hear the word for planet? Planontai. The planets are what?
Wanderers.
The wanderers. They're not stable. They're not fixed, as the ancients believed that the stars were. The planets wander through the night sky. So, the author of Hebrews, summarizing Psalm 95, God says, I was angered at this generation, and I said, they are always wandering, going astray. And they are going astray, he says, in their heart. And they have not known my ways. And so, the next verse, God says, I swore, I took an oath in my wrath. And here's the oath that God took. They shall not by any means enter into my rest. Now, the Greek word for rest here is the word katapausis. Can you say that with me? Katapausis. And it means the state of cessation from labor. The moment when you're finally able to lay your burdens down. And it is also associated in the Old Testament with the Sabbath, with a time that is hallowed by rest. Some years ago, the Rabbi Bernard Barsky, who has taught here, visited Diane and I when we were in Greece. And the Sabbath came. And, of course, he couldn't go anywhere or do any work. He couldn't even pay for lunch at the local restaurant. So I asked him, now, Bernie, what's going on here? And he said to me, Larry, what you need to do is get in touch with your Sabbath soul. You have a Sabbath soul, he said, a place where you can find rest. And for the Israelites, that place where they could finally rest from their wandering was what? The Promised Land. And so God swears an oath that they will not, that those people who have hardened their heart, who have become embittered, shall not enter into God's rest. And as we know, of all that generation that left Egypt, how many people actually entered the Promised Land? Only two. Who were they?
Aaron.
Joshua and Caleb. Not even Moses. And the author continues, see to it, brothers and sisters, that there will not be in any of you an evil heart, faithless, apistia, in the desertion. And here it's the verb form of the word apostasy. The desertion of the living God. So, faithlessness, a lack of trust, leads to desertion. But instead, Keep on exhorting yourselves each day. Here it comes again. As long as it is called what? Today. Semeron. Lest any of you become hardened. And the Greek verb there is skleruno, which means, listen to this, skleruno means to be unyielding in resisting information, resisting what is told, what you've been told. So again, the importance of listening to God, of hearing God. Lest any of you become hardened in the deceit of sin. And the word that's used here for deceit is the word apate, which means deceptive pleasure or seduction. And then the author concludes, for we have become partakers. The translation partakers is not wrong, but it fails to capture the word metochoi, which is used elsewhere in Greek, Chuck, of citizens. We have become citizens of Christ if we hold firm to the initial reality that we experienced, to the end. And here, this is how you do it. He says, you should say to yourselves, today. And now, Gary, comes the explicit quotation of Psalm 95. Today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts, as in the embitterment that led to rebellion. For who was it who heard and then became embittered? Who didn't listen carefully enough? They rebelled. Was it not all who came out of Egypt through Moses? With whom was He angered for 40 years? Was it not with those who were not persuaded, whose limbs fell in the wilderness? To whom did He swear that they would not enter His rest, except those who were faithless, who were unfaithful? So we see that it was because of their faithlessness, apistia, that they were not able to enter. Now, we've already unpacked this passage. I just want to make a couple of observations. Chuck?
So, is Hebrews linked in any way to, I'm not going to be pronouncing this right, but Splakinsonia?
Good. Thank you. Last week we discovered, when we looked at Christ in the wilderness, that Jesus responded to His mission. He responded to people who were in need with what? A gut-wrenching experience. Compassion would be a weak translation of it, but not a bad translation. And what we're going to discover, Chuck, you're about 2 steps ahead of me, what we're going to discover in just a minute is that the most important thing for the author of Hebrews is maintaining what he calls pistis, which we translate faith, but in a few minutes I'm going to demonstrate that for the author of Hebrews, faith has an emotional or affective and a behavioral component that it doesn't have for most of us who live on this side of Descartes and the Enlightenment. And when we talk about faith, we're talking about what? A subjective mental attitude. Do you believe in Santa Claus, right? That's not what this author is talking about. He's talking about an emotional and behavioral response to God. Michael?
I'll make an argument that this is definitely probably 80 to 100 just because of the physical situation. And that is that earlier in the 60s and 70s was a time of extensive persecution. And if you wanted to be a Christian, you had better be a very faithful Christian or you weren't going to make it. In which case, yeah, you can talk about the great saints of our past who endured the persecution. However, from after that initial period of persecution, from then up until about 250, the persecutions were very infrequent, very localized, and it was usually when Christians started acting up. And the reason I say acting up is that the early Christian community really living out what it was supposed to be was just almost a shame to their surrounding people because of their inclusiveness, because of their charity, and they got noticed and therefore persecuted. So one way to avoid the persecutions was just to hunker down and not live out what you were supposed to be doing.
Right.
So you had a kind of a physical wilderness with the persecutions. Now the temptation is hunker down, don't follow Christ, don't follow that example, avoid, raising your head and getting it chopped off.
Right.
And that this is what the writer of Hebrews is arguing against, is that kind of, let's pull back and not do anything and be peaceful and calm and not have to endure the wilderness of persecution.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me. It's shrinking back, right? It's losing your confidence that the author is concerned about. Now, before we turn to chapter 11, I just have a couple of comments on chapter 3. First, the embitterment that leads to rebellion of the wilderness generation is associated with two places in the Old Testament. A place called Meribah, which means to find fault, to find fault with God. And it's associated with a place called Massah, which means to test, to put God to the test. Okay, now the great chapter, chapter 11 of Hebrews. And now we get our second picture of Israel and the faithful people in the wilderness. And this time the wilderness is a place of sojourn, of traveling by faith. You could quote for me, I don't need to tell you, you could quote the first verse of Hebrews chapter 11, couldn't you? Now faith is what? The reality, or you could translate it substance. Now faith is the reality of the things that we hope for. It is the proof of the things that we do not yet see. Now, the Greek word here that we translate faith is, of course, the word pistis. Can you say that with me? Pistis. And the Hebrew concept that's found in the Old Testament is amunah. Can you say that with me? Amunah. Now, we are tempted today to think of faith in a modern sense as a belief. Chuck, this is where you were drawing us. A subjective mental attitude. I believe that, right? It's something subjective and something intellectual. But that is not what amunah means in the Old Testament, and it's not what pistis means for this author in the New Testament. The Hebrew tradition understands faith as emotional and behavioral. It would be better translated with what kind of language? Trust. Trust. Trust in a relationship. Trust that leads to what? Fidelity. That leads to faithfulness. within the relationship. So, in the Old Testament, this word, amuna, pistis, designates the proper relationship between the human beings and God, between Israel and Yahweh. Now, I told you that there is some similarity between the author of Hebrews and an Alexandrian Jew named Philo, who lived in the early 1st century and who offered the same kind of typological or allegorical interpretations that we find in Hebrews. Now, Philo says something about the faithfulness of Abraham in his book on the wandering, the migration of Abraham. And I think it helps us actually understand the psychology of what Hebrews is trying to say about faith. Here's a little quotation that I wrote down for today from Philo. This is Migration of Abraham, chapter 44. Listen. For the soul, clinging in utter dependence on a good hope, and deeming or thinking that the things not present are beyond question already present by reason of the sure faithfulness of God, the God that promised them, that soul has as its reward faith, a perfect good. Do you see how psychologically this works according to Philo? Now put yourself in this place, along with me, when you were younger and perhaps even today. You've managed to hold on to hope. Hope that things will get better. Hope that our society will be just. And if you know what it is like to feel those hopes, you're hoping for something that is what? Not present. You can't see it. Faith is the reality of things what? Hoped for, the proof of things that we do not see. But the promise is that God is faithful. And if you put your trust in that, then you can go forward, you can keep going, believing that, trusting that, God will do what God has promised. And the gift, the reward of that attitude, of that relationship is what? Faith. A perfect good. Chuck?
I'm going to ask a kind of a strange question. So, I'm hearing that faith has a political meaning. In that the followers of Jesus from a compassionate point of view see the compassion in their own community.
Right.
They're caring for one another, they're doing all those things.
Even for people in prison.
Even for people in prison. But those in power who have power over them.
Right.
That is what they do not yet see.
Right. That's right.
And that is why they call themselves citizens.
Right. They're citizens of Christ.
They're citizens of Christ. They want to be citizens of the world.
Right.
And they cannot yet be that.
Right.
Because the world...
Yes, exactly.
Am I getting that?
You're getting it. You're getting it.
So faith has a political component.
You're getting it. And that's brought out by that Greek word metochoi, right? And also by the whole structure of the argument. Because our time is fleeting away, I have to bring this to a conclusion. As you know, In the rest of chapter 11 of Hebrews, the author calls the roll of the faithful. By faith, Abraham did what? Left his home and went to a place that God said He would show him. By faith, Abraham and Sarah, even though they were so old and she was evidently barren, they what? Had relations, and she conceived. And he goes through the whole roll call of the faithful. And then he comes down to this verse. Listen. In faith, all of these people died, since they did not yet receive the promises. But they saw them and greeted them from afar. And they confessed, Chuck, that they were strangers still and sojourners on this present earth. For those who say such things make clear that they are still seeking a homeland. And if they had in mind the homeland from which they had departed, namely Egypt, they would then have found time to return. But in fact, they were yearning for a greater homeland. That is a heavenly one. And therefore, God was not ashamed to be called their God. For God is preparing a city for them. Now, I have a autobiographical connection actually to this text. And if I tell you the story briefly, maybe you will bring this text home in a similar way. Before Diane and I moved here to Dayton, we lived in Chicago. And I was much more, Chuck, politically active in those days. I campaigned for Harold Washington, the first African-American mayor of Chicago. And together with a student of mine who had become a pastor, Frank Thomas, he and I encouraged some church members to go into the housing projects on the south side of Chicago and to paint those apartments and fix them up. So I was much more politically active. And then those of you that know the history of Chicago, what happened? Harold Washington, who had assembled this rainbow coalition of good-hearted people, mainly church people, that's where the movement started. Harold Washington what? Died of a heart attack in his office in City Hall. And after that, guess what happened? The coalition fell apart. People began to fight each other. In the city council, there were council wars with people from different factions throwing coins at each other. Yeah, across the floor of City Hall. And as I watched the collapse of everything that I had hoped for, and became increasingly embittered, and began to lose my what?
Faith.
Confidence and faith, I withdrew, I shrank back. And the good thing about teaching in a seminary is that your students are what? Pastors in training, or people who have now become pastors. So when a couple of weeks went by, and my former student, Frank Thomas, who now, by the way, is the professor of homiletics, preaching at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. But when a couple of weeks went by and he didn't hear from me, and he figured that I was discouraged and embittered and that I was shrinking back, he called me up. And he said, "Larry, let's go have lunch." We went to a little Italian place on the south side of Chicago called Piccolo Mondo. And we talked for a long time, and I poured out my whole heart to him. And Frank shook his head, and he smiled, and he said, "Well, I never thought I would have to do this." He said, "I'm going to have to give a scripture to a New Testament professor." And this is the scripture that he gave me. He said, look, Larry, I'm sure you know the great roll call of faith. All those people, Abraham and Jacob, Isaac, Sarah, Rebecca, they all kept going somehow by faith. But he says, here's what you probably haven't noticed at the end of the chapter. The author says, now all these people what? Died without having received what? The promise. But they kept what? Looking for it by faith. They kept yearning for it, right? They kept going. And therefore, what? God was not ashamed to be what? Called their God. And God is preparing a city for them. I have to tell you all the truth. I sat there at that restaurant on the south side of Chicago and I wept. And I discovered my faith again to keep going. At the very end of chapter 13, the author concludes, and what should I say? For time would run out to tell about all the faithful people, Gideon, Samson, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith overcame kingdoms, produced justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, and women who received their dead by resurrection while others were tortured, and even though they experienced taunts and lashes, bonds and prison, they were stoned and sawn asunder, slain by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goat skins. They were deprived, oppressed, and maltreated. Of all these the world was not worthy. While they wandered over the wilderness, and on mountains and caves, and in the holes of the earth. And all these, though they have received the attestation through faith, did not obtain the promise, since God planned to provide something better for us, so that they might not be perfected without us, or so that we might be perfected together with them. Okay, so here is the lesson. For all of us who can remember the early confidence and passion, the early zeal that we might have felt for a good cause, for justice, right? For all of us who can remember that, but who as time has passed have become what? Yeah, maybe a little bitter, perhaps a little complacent or lazy, who have been tempted to shrink back. The word for us is a word about faith. It's a word about trust, maintaining the trust in God. When I woke up this morning and I turned on National Public Radio, there's a morning show called Rise When the Rooster Crows. Have you heard it? Yeah. And the announcer this morning reminded us that today is Bob Dylan's birthday. The singer of progressive movements, the singer of revolution. And after that initial period of fervor, Dylan went into decline. He shrank back. And then he had a comeback album where he tried to find his faith. A couple of those albums. And one of them, the first one, the album was called Tangled Up in Blue. And I'll just quote the last verse of that song. He says, now I'm going back again. I've got to get to her somehow. All the people we used to know, they're an illusion to me now. Some are mathematicians, some are carpenters' wives. I don't know how all that got started. I don't know what they're doing with their lives. But me, I'm still on the road, looking for another place. We always did feel the same. We just saw it from a different point of view, tangled up in blue. Well, I've taken more time than I should have today, but that's the message of this letter. And The author of the letter believes that we can remain faithful if we keep looking toward Jesus, who is the author, he says, and perfecter of our faith. And he reminds the Hebrews that Jesus himself learned faithfulness by what he suffered. He learned faithfulness by what he suffered, and so he became the guide for us. And in the writing itself, the author tries to mobilize faithfulness by arguing that our experience is actually two-dimensional. As you said, Chuck, there is the dimension of what we can see, right? What we can see now. And then there is what? The things that we cannot see, but that we only hope for. And in the writing, the author establishes a relationship between these two dimensions. He argues that there are some things we can't see, either because they transcend us, they're too big for us. We don't know the consequences of our striving for justice. It transcends us. There are some things we can't see because they lie where? In the future, right? There may be consequences someday. And as Martin King said at the end of his life, I may not get there with you, but we as a people will what? Get to the promised land. So that's how the author tries to mobilize faithfulness. He says that we don't live in just one dimension. We live in two dimensions. There are things that we can see, but there are things that we can't see, that we hope for. And the glue that holds these two dimensions together is what? Faith. It's our trust in God. And to maintain that trust, he points toward Jesus. Okay, I'm so sorry that I've gone way too long. 15 minutes beyond what I intended. But I think this is a beautiful and important text. If I can persuade you to come back next week, we will conclude our course by following a woman into the wilderness where she is threatened and attacked by a serpent, a dragon. Where is that found?
Revelation.
The book of Revelation, the Apocalypse. Thank you.